Now that we know why demand curves slope downward and how they shift, let's make an important distinction regarding these curves. The distinction between a movement along curves versus a shift of curves. This figure illustrates a movement along the demand curve for pizzas. In the figure, we go from point A to point B because the price of pizza has fallen from $3.50 per slice to $2. In this case, there has been a change in the quantity demanded. In contrast, this figure illustrates a change in demand. This might happen if incomes rise, or in the much more unlikely case that pizza is proven to be a miracle health food. Note that for a given price, such as $3.50, demand increases, in this case from 3 to 5 slices. As we shall see later, making this distinction between the quantity demanded and a change in demand is important because it helps us pinpoint the source of a change in the market. The last point we want to make about the market demand curve is that it is the horizontal sum of the individual demand curves. That's both a mouthful and a mindful, so let me repeat that. The market demand curve is the horizontal sum of the individual demand curves. Why do we want to know this? It is very useful, particularly from a marketing point of view, to understand how a single market demand curve comes from the very many different tastes and preferences of individual consumers. Let's turn now to the supply curve. It depends, perhaps most obviously, on the firm's ability to produce. To transform factors of production like raw materials and labor and capital into consumable goods. However, supply also depends on the individual's decisions to supply the factors of production to begin with. That's why later on we'll spend a whole part of this course just studying how wages and rents and interest rates are set in the labor, land, and capital markets. Now, in explaining supply, let's start with the business analog to the law of demand on the consumer side. This is the so-called law of supply, and we can illustrate it using this supply schedule for cornflakes. Why don't you try first drawing a supply curve from this data? Now, does your cornflake supply curve look like this? Again, did you label your axes correctly? I'll bug you about this because I've found that students often forget to label not only their axes, but the curves as well. More often than not, this leads to confusion. So always label everything in your graphs and you will be way ahead of the game. Anyway, in this figure, firms will produce no cornflakes at all if the price is only 1, but they will produce 18 million boxes if the price is 5. The implication, then, of an upward sloping supply curve is that the lower the price, ceteris paribus, the less units firms will produce, and the higher the price, holding other things constant, the more firms will produce. This is the law of supply. As with demand curves, there likewise are shift factors that influence the supply curve. One of the most important is technology. Suppose your company comes up with a new, cost-saving, computerized process for making cornflakes. What do you think will happen to the supply curve? That's right, it will shift outwards, meaning that for a given price, say at point B, supply increases. This is a change in supply. And remember, this is different from a movement along the supply curve from a change in price. Now, how about another shift factor? Input prices. Suppose the price of labor or raw materials increases for cornflakes manufacturers. What happens now to the supply curve? That's right, it shifts inward, so you supply less at a given price. Still, a third important shift factor is government policy. This can be a very big cost factor for businesses. For example, if the government imposes stricter environmental regulations, manufacturers will see their costs rise and the supply curve will shift inwards. While such regulations will improve the quality of the air and water, they will also make goods more expensive. Such regulations, as well as others for health and safety, may even put domestic producers of things like, say, automobiles and steel at a disadvantage to foreign competitors. Conversely, if Congress removes tariffs and quotas on, say, the auto industry, the supply curve will shift outward as auto imports increase. This table summarizes the major shift factors, using the automobile industry as an example. Each of these shift factors will cause a shift in supply, whereas a change in price causes a movement along the supply curve. Please study this table carefully before advancing the presentation.